My wife looked at me with a coldness I had never seen in 42 years of marriage. Her perfectly manicured fingers tapped on my mahogany desk. She laughed a dry, humorless sound. "You will have to beg me for coffee money, Arthur. Forget about the credit cards. Forget about the bank accounts. From now on, if you want a single cent to buy a cup of coffee, you ask me first. And if I am in a good mood, maybe I will give it to you." My son, Julian, the boy I raised and sent to the best private academies, just sat there nodding, looking at his mother with admiration. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was finished. They had no idea that they had just started a war they could never win. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 74 years old, and until that Tuesday morning, I thought I was the respected patriarch of a loving family. I built Vance Logistics from a single rented flatbed truck and a storage unit in Chicago into a logistics giant with a fleet of 150 trucks and 200 employees. I gave my wife Victoria a life of luxury. I gave my son Julian a career he did not earn. If you have ever felt betrayed by family, hit that like button right now. It helps this story reach others who need to hear it. And please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss how I turn the tables on them. It started on a Tuesday that felt like any other. I put on my favorite charcoal suit and drove my vintage 1968 Mercedes-Benz to the Bean and Leaf, a coffee shop 3 blocks from our Lake Forest estate. The baristas knew me and my order. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," the young girl at the counter, Sarah, said. "The usual today?" "Yes, please, Sarah," I said, pulling out my wallet. I pulled out my American Express Platinum card, a card with no limit. I tapped it on the reader and waited for the beep. Instead, there was a harsh buzz. The screen flashed red. "Declined. Try it again, please," I said. Sarah tapped it again. Buzz. Declined. "Mr. Vance, it says the card is inactive," she whispered. The line was getting long. A man behind me sighed. My face felt hot. Shame is a feeling I had not felt in decades. I was Arthur Vance. My bills were always paid early. "Let me use the Visa," I said. I pulled out the backup card, the one linked to the joint operational account. Processing. Then that terrible red light again. Contact bank, restricted card. My hand started to shake. There was over $250,000 in that checking account yesterday. "Is everything okay, sir?" Sarah asked. I dug into my pocket and found a $20 bill. "Cash. Keep the change," I muttered, grabbing the cup. I walked out of the shop, my ears burning. I sat in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I called the bank. The automated voice was cheerful. "We are sorry, but the access code you entered is invalid. Please contact the primary account holder." Primary account holder. That was me. It had always been me. I drove home. I did not drive fast. I drove with a terrifying, calculated slowness. My mind was racing. Was it identity theft? But deep down, I knew it was not a stranger. A stranger steals money and runs. A stranger does not change access codes. I pulled into the driveway of the house I had built 20 years ago. It was a sprawling Lake Forest estate, beautiful and imposing. I walked through the front door. The house was quiet, too quiet. "Victoria," I called out. No answer. I walked toward my home office. The double oak doors were closed. I reached for the handle and pushed them open. My son Julian was sitting in my chair. He was leaning back, his feet up on my mahogany desk, wearing one of his expensive Italian suits that I paid for. He was spinning a pen between his fingers. My pen. Victoria was sitting on the leather sofa across from him, sipping a glass of iced tea. They looked like they were in the middle of a pleasant business meeting. They looked ready. "What is going on?" I asked, my voice low. "I went to buy a coffee and my cards were declined. Both of them. The bank says I am not the primary account holder." Julian took his feet off the desk. He smiled a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Oh, that. Yes. We were going to tell you tonight at dinner, Dad. But I guess you found out early. Tell me what? That you robbed me?" Victoria set her iced tea down. "Arthur, do not be dramatic. Nobody robbed you. We had a meeting with the family attorney this morning. We did it under the power of attorney clause you signed 5 years ago. Remember when you had that heart scare? You signed a document giving us control if you were ever incapacitated or deemed unfit to manage complex assets. I am not incapacitated," I roared. "I am standing right here. I ran a board meeting yesterday. I drove here. I am perfectly fine." Victoria sighed. "Arthur, listen to yourself. You are shouting. You are red in the face. This is exactly what we are talking about. You are getting older. You are becoming erratic. We have noticed it for months. I do not forget things, I snapped. Julian stood up then. Dad, look. We are doing this for your own good. The market is volatile. We want to protect the legacy. We transferred the liquid assets into a secure trust managed by Victoria and me. It is safer this way. Safer? I spat. You embarrassed me in public. You cut off my access to my own money. It is not your money anymore, Arthur, Victoria said softly. It is the family's money, and you have spent enough of it. All those donations to veteran charities. The restoration of that old car. We are just putting a tourniquet on the wound. I looked from my wife to my son and saw the greed in their eyes. So what happens now? I asked. How do I buy food? Victoria reached into her purse and tossed a generic prepaid debit card onto the desk. There is $500 on that, she said. That is your allowance for the week. If you need more, you can submit a request to Julian. I looked at the cheap plastic card, $500. I had generated millions in revenue last year alone, and now I was being put on an allowance like a child. You cannot do this, I said. We already did, Julian said. Now, Dad, go take a nap. You look tired. I stood there, my heart pounding. I wanted to grab Julian by his collar, but they expected me to explode. If I did, they would call the police to prove I was unstable. I took a deep breath, picked up the card, and looked at Victoria. I will not forget this, I said. She laughed. Oh, Arthur, you will forget now. Run along. I turned and walked out. The sun had set by the time I returned home from my drive, casting long, jagged shadows across the manicured lawn I used to mow myself on weekends. I walked into the house. The silence from earlier now, replaced by the clattering of silverware and the hum of conversation. Dinner was being served. In the past, this was my favorite time of day, when the noise of the trucks and logistics dispatch faded away, and I could just be a husband and a father. But as I walked into the dining room, I realized that life was gone. I was walking into a shark tank. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, was sitting at the head of the table, my seat. She was 80 years old, a woman who had never worked a day in her life but had strong opinions on how everyone else should work. She was wearing a silk blouse that I knew cost more than the first flatbed truck I ever bought. Her fingers were dripping with diamonds, her hair perfectly coiffed. When she saw me attend her, she did not smile. She just raised a painted eyebrow, looking at me as if I were a waiter who had brought the wrong order. You are late, Arthur, she said, her voice sharp and scratchy. We started without you. The soup is cold. I looked around the table. Victoria was there, sipping wine. Julian was there, scrolling on his phone. Nobody looked up. There was a place set for me, but it was on the side, squeezed between the sideboard and a large vase of flowers. They had physically moved me from the head of the table. The chair was different, too. It was one of the extra folding chairs we used for large parties, not my high-backed leather chair. I sat down and looked at my plate, a small piece of dry chicken and some wilted salad. Then I looked at the center of the table. There was a bottle of wine breathing in a crystal decanter. I recognized the label immediately. It was a Chateau Margaux, a vintage I had been saving for my 50th wedding anniversary, a bottle worth $2,000. I watched Victoria pour a generous glass for Beatrice. The deep red liquid swirled in the crystal. I see we are celebrating, I said, unfolding my napkin. Beatrice took a sip, closing her eyes dramatically. It is decent, she said, smacking her lips. A bit oaky, but it will do. Victoria, darling, pass the bread. I felt a vein throb in my temple. She was drinking liquid gold and calling it decent. I thought we were on a budget, I said, keeping my voice even. You gave me a prepaid card with $500 for the week and told me not to buy cigars. Yet you are drinking a $2,000 bottle of wine on a Tuesday night. Victoria sighed, putting her glass down with a heavy clink. Oh, Arthur, do not start. Beatrice is a guest. We cannot serve her box wine. Besides, this was already in the cellar. We did not spend money to buy it. It is inventory. Inventory, I repeated. It is my personal collection. Julian chimed in, his mouth full of potatoes. Stop being so possessive, Dad. It is unattractive. Beatrice let out a short, harsh laugh. Possessive? That is a funny word coming from you, Arthur. She turned her cold, watery eyes toward me. You know you should be thanking Victoria. She is trying to save you from ruin. But all you do is complain. You walk in here late looking like a vagrant and immediately start counting pennies. It is distinctively lower class. I gripped my fork. I had paid for Beatrice's hip surgery. her Florida condo, and her husband's funeral. Now I was lower class. I am asking for consistency, I said. If I am on an allowance, I expect the household to tighten their belts too. The table went silent. Beatrice lowered her fork, looking at me with contempt. Tighten our belts? Arthur, you are old and useless. You do not bring anything to this table. Julian runs the company. Victoria manages the house. You are just a mouth to feed. In the wild, old lions are left behind to starve. We are kind enough to keep you indoors, but do not mistake charity for equality. You are a guest here, and an expensive one. I waited for Victoria to defend me. I waited for her to say, Mom, stop it. Arthur worked for 42 years to buy this food. I waited for Julian to say, Grandma, that is too far. He is my father. But nobody said a word. Victoria looked down at her plate, a small smile playing on her lips. Julian just smirked, shaking his head. Actually, Beatrice said, leaning forward, you are not even a guest. A guest is invited. You are more like a freeloader. Yes, that is the word. A freeloader living off the success of his wife and son. They laughed. All three of them. They sat in the house I built, eating the food I bought, and they laughed at me. I felt something break inside me, but it was not my heart. It was the last chain of loyalty I had to these people. You do not call the man who feeds you a freeloader unless you have completely lost your soul. I did not scream or flip the table. Instead, I carefully placed my fork and knife on the plate and wiped my mouth with the linen napkin. You are right. Beatrice, I said softly. The laughter died down, replaced by confused silence. Yes, I said. I have been resting on my laurels. I suppose I should be grateful that you are all willing to manage the complexities of my wealth while I just sit here. Victoria relaxed, her shoulders dropping. Well, I am glad you finally see it that way, Arthur, she said. I stood up and picked up my plate. Where are you going? Julian asked. I am going to put my dishes in the dishwasher, I said. Like a good freeloader. I would not want to burden the maid. I walked into the kitchen. As the swinging door closed behind me, I heard them start talking again, discussing a vacation to Italy. I stood over the sink, staring at the dirty plate. My reflection in the dark window looked back at me. I looked tired, yes, but I also looked dangerous. Beatrice had called me an old lion left to starve. She forgot one thing. Old lions are the most dangerous because they know how to hunt in the dark. I washed the plate and repeated the word in my mind. Freeloader. I would tattoo that word onto my brain. I would use it as fuel. Every time I felt tired in the days to come, I would remember Beatrice's face. The next morning I woke up early, before the sun had even cleared the horizon. The house was dead quiet. I dressed in an older gray suit, slipped the Green Dot debit card and my wallet into my pocket, and walked out the back door. I avoided the garage. If I went near my Mercedes, Julian might come out and start talking about selling it again, and I could not risk losing my temper. I walked out the front gate, past the manicured hedges, and down the sidewalk. I walked for 3 blocks until I reached the bus stop. I had not taken a bus in over 20 years. But Arthur Vance was a man who knew how to adapt. The bus ride to the industrial park was a lesson in humility. I sat on the vinyl seat between a young woman with headphones and a man who smelled of grease and coffee. I clutched the cheap prepaid card in my pocket, feeling the plastic edges. I did not want to use it to buy the bus ticket, so I paid with the few cash dollars I had left in my wallet. If I used the Green Dot card, Julian and Victoria would see the transaction on their online portal. They would know exactly where I was going. They thought I was going to the park to sit on a bench and feel sorry for myself. I let them think that. When the bus hissed to a halt 2 blocks from Vance Logistics, my legs felt stiff. The morning wind off Lake Michigan was cold, but it felt clean. I walked the familiar path, a path I had driven thousands of times in my truck and later in my Mercedes. The building rose before me, a sturdy 3-story structure of brick and glass. Seeing it usually filled me with a quiet pride. It was the physical proof of 40 years of sweat, late nights, and sacrifices. But today, as I looked up at the sign that read Vance Logistics, a cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. The building looked the same, but the atmosphere felt hostile. I pushed through the glass double doors, expecting the warm oak reception desks I had installed 20 years ago. Instead, I was met by a slab of cold white marble that looked more like a headstone than a welcome station. Behind it sat a young woman I had never seen before. She was typing furiously on her smartphone, her long acrylic nails clicking loudly against the screen. She did not look up when I entered. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice calm and firm. She held up a finger, finishing her text message before slowly lifting her eyes. She looked at me with a blank, bored expression. "Can I help you, sir? Deliveries are around the back." "I am not a delivery driver," I said, stepping closer. "I am Arthur Vance. I am the founder and owner of this company." She blinked, then typed something into her computer. "I do not see an Arthur Vance in the employee directory," she said, her voice dripping with artificial politeness. "Are you here to see someone specific? Do you have an appointment?" My blood began to boil. I built the walls she was sitting within. I paid for the electricity powering her computer, and she was asking if I had an appointment. "I do not need an appointment to enter my own building," I said, my voice rising slightly. "Where is Sarah, the receptionist who has worked here for 10 years? "Oh, Sarah was let go last week," the girl said, popping a piece of gum into her mouth. "Restructuring. I am Tiffany. If you do not have an appointment, sir, I am going to have to ask you to wait in the lobby while I call security." "Security? We never had security. We were a family business. We trusted our employees, and they trusted us." I ignored Tiffany and walked past the marble desk, heading straight for the hallway that led to the executive offices. "Sir, you cannot go back there!" Tiffany shrieked, scrambling to grab her phone. I did not stop. I marched down the hallway. The walls used to be lined with photos of our drivers, our trucks, and the major shipping projects we had completed over the decades. Now, the walls were bare. The photos were gone, replaced by abstract, soulless art that meant nothing. It was as if they were scrubbing my history from the very walls. I needed to see Frank Miller. Frank had been my chief financial officer for 30 years. He was the only man who knew the accounts better than I did, and he was the moral compass of Vance Logistics. If anyone could explain what was happening with the bank accounts and the sudden legal restructuring, it was Frank. I reached the door at the end of the hall, the corner office that had been Frank's for 3 decades. The brass nameplate that used to say Frank Miller, CFO, was gone. In its place was a white sticky note that read Acting Finance Director. I did not knock. I threw the door open. "Frank, we need to talk," I started to say. But the man sitting behind the desk was not Frank. He was a young man, maybe in his late 20s, with slick-back hair and a suit that cost more than my first flatbed truck. He was standing next to a paper shredder that was humming loudly, feeding sheets of paper into it as fast as he could. He jumped when I entered, looking like a thief caught in the act. He quickly slammed his hand down on a manila folder on the desk, covering whatever he was reading. "Who are you?" I demanded, stepping into the room. "And where is Frank?" The young man stood up, adjusting his tie. He had a nervous, weasel-like quality to him. "You must be Mr. Vance," he said, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I heard you might be stopping by. I am Jason. Julian hired me to modernize the accounts." "Modernize?" I spat the word out. "Where is Frank Miller?" Jason cleared his throat, his eyes darting to the door behind me. "Mr. Miller decided to take an early retirement, effective immediately. He wanted to spend more time with his family in Florida." "Liar!" I shouted. "Frank's wife died 5 years ago, and he has no children. This job is his life. He would never leave in the middle of a fiscal quarter." "What did you do to him?" Before Jason could answer, I walked around the desk. I wanted to see what was in that manila folder. I wanted to see what he was shredding. "Sir, please, you cannot be back here," Jason stammered, backing away. "These are confidential corporate documents." "Confidential from whom?" I roared, my hand reaching for the folder. "I am the founder of this company." Jason tried to block me with his arm, but he was slight and frail. I shoved past him easily, my hand clamping down on the folder. Before I could open it, the office door flew open with a bang. "Dad, what the hell are you doing?" It was Julian. He stood in the doorway, his face flushed with anger. He had taken off his suit jacket, his tie was slightly askew, and he looked incredibly stressed. 2 large security guards in black uniforms stood behind him, looking ready for trouble. I turned to face my son, clutching the folder to my chest. "Where is Frank, Julian? Why is this kid sitting in his office? Why is he shredding documents?" Julian walked into the room and snatched the folder from my hand with a sharp jerk. He tossed it back onto the desk behind Jason. "Frank was old, Dad, just like you. He could not keep up with the new systems. He was making mistakes. We gave him a generous severance package and sent him on his way. It was time for fresh blood. Jason here is a wizard with international tax structures. Fresh blood, I said, looking at Jason, who was now standing safely behind Julian, a smug expression returning to his face. You mean someone who will do whatever you tell him? Someone who does not ask questions? Frank would never have allowed you to restrict my bank access. Frank would never have let you transfer assets without my signature. Julian sighed. Running a hand through his hair, he looked at me with a mixture of irritation and pity. This is exactly why we had to take control, Dad. You are paranoid. You are shouting at our new staff. You are disrupting the workflow. Look at Jason. He is terrified. I looked at Jason. He did not look terrified. He looked guilty. I want to see the books, Julian, I said, forcing my voice to drop to a low, dangerous whisper. I want to see the ledgers for the last 6 months. If everything is legal and above board, show me. Julian laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet office. You would not even understand them, Dad. It is all digital now. It is in the cloud. You barely know how to check your email. Go home. Go enjoy your retirement. Stop trying to micromanage a world you no longer belong in. I am not going anywhere until I get answers, I said. Planting my feet on the carpet, Julian did not argue. He just nodded to the 2 security guards standing in the doorway. Escort Mr. Vance to the exit, please, and make sure he does not take any company files with him. The 2 guards stepped into the room. They were big men, their uniforms tight across their chests. They looked at me not with respect, but as a minor nuisance to be removed from the premises. Mr. Vance, please come with us, the larger of the 2 said, reaching for my arm. Do not touch me, I snapped, pulling my arm back. I looked at my son one last time. You are making a mistake, Julian, a very big mistake. Julian did not even look at me. He was already checking his phone. Goodbye, Dad. Take the bus home. It builds character. I walked out of the office, the 2 guards flanking me, like I was a convict being marched to a cell. We walked down the hallway, past the open doors of the other offices. The employees I had hired, people whose families I knew, whose kids' college funds I had helped pay for, looked up. They saw me being marched out, but as soon as they met my eyes, they quickly looked down at their desks. They were afraid. They saw the writing on the wall. If the founder of the company could be thrown out like trash, none of them were safe. We reached the lobby. Tiffany, the new receptionist, watched us walk by with a smug little smile, her acrylic nails tapping on her phone. Have a nice day, sir, she called out, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The guards pushed the glass double doors open, and I stumbled out onto the concrete sidewalk. The heavy doors clicked shut behind me, locking automatically. I stood there for a moment, the morning sun heating my face, but I felt freezing cold inside. I looked at the glass doors. I could see my reflection. My tie was slightly crooked, my hair was messy from the wind, and my suit looked old. I looked exactly like the crazy old man they wanted everyone to believe I was. But as I straightened my tie and smoothed my jacket, my mind began to work with a terrifying clarity. Frank Miller was not retired. A loyal CFO of 30 years does not just leave for Florida in the middle of a fiscal quarter without saying goodbye to his lifelong friend. You do not fire a CFO unless he refuses to do something illegal. And you do not hire a nervous kid who shreds documents unless you have something to hide. Julian thought he had won this round. He thought that by kicking me out, he had blinded me. He was wrong. He had just confirmed my worst fears. I walked away from the building, not toward the bus stop, but down the street toward the Oak Diner. A small greasy spoon, where Frank and I used to eat lunch every Tuesday. If Frank was really in Florida, he would not be there. But if he was scared, if he was hiding, he might be close by. I touched the green dot card in my pocket. I had been kicked out of my own building, but I was not out of the fight. I pushed open the door of the Oak Diner, the familiar bell chiming overhead. The smell of grease, bacon, and strong coffee hit me, a sensory anchor in a world that had turned upside down. I scanned the booths. It was past the morning rush, and the diner was mostly empty. At the very back, in a booth partially hidden by a plastic partition, sat a man with white hair, his shoulders slumped as he stared into a white ceramic mug. It was Frank. He was not in Florida. He was sitting in Chicago, stirring a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. I walked over, my boots squeaking on the linoleum floor. I slid into the booth opposite him. Frank jumped, his hand jerking so hard he spilled a few drops of coffee onto the laminate table. When he saw my face, his eyes went wide, and he immediately looked toward the glass windows of the diner, checking to see if anyone had followed me. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice shaking, "what are you doing here? You should not be seen with me." "I should not be seen in my own company either, apparently," I said, leaning forward. "I just got kicked out by security. Julian and some kid named Jason are running the office. Jason is shredding files." "What is going on, Frank? They told me you retired to Florida." Frank let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Florida. I hate the heat and they know it. They forced me out, Arthur, last Wednesday." "Why didn't you call me?" I asked, a wave of hurt washing over me. "We have been friends for 30 years, Frank. We built that place together." Frank looked down at his coffee mug. He looked older than his 68 years. The dark circles under his eyes told me he had not slept in days. "They threatened me, Arthur. Not with violence, but with something worse for a man my age." Julian had a file. He showed me fake transaction logs, bank transfers with my digital signature on them. He told me that if I did not sign a non-disclosure agreement and resign immediately, they would release those logs to the police. They were going to frame me for embezzling $500, zero from the company accounts. I stared at him, my jaw tight. "Embezzlement? That is ridiculous. You would never touch a cent." "I know that, and you know that," Frank said, his voice trembling. "But the documentation looked real. That kid Jason is a genius with forensic forgery. He set me up. They gave me a choice: sign the papers, walk away and pretend to retire, or spend my golden years in a federal penitentiary defending myself against charges that would ruin my late wife's name." I had to leave, Arthur. I was terrified. "What were they trying to get you to sign before they threatened you?" I asked. Frank leaned closer, his voice dropping so low I had to strain to hear it over the hum of the diner's refrigerator. "Julian wanted me to authorize a series of massive wire transfers to an offshore shell company called Vance Holdings LLC, registered in Panama. It was over $4,000. I refused. I told him that without your physical signature and a board resolution, those transfers were illegal. That was when he brought out the forged power of attorney. I felt a chill run down my spine. "The power of attorney from 5 years ago?" "Yes," Frank nodded. "But it was modified, Arthur. The original document we drafted after your heart scare had strict limits. It only allowed Victoria to make medical decisions if you were in a coma or medically incapacitated. The document Julian showed me had been altered. It gave them full financial control over all Vance Logistics assets, including the ability to sell corporate property and liquidate bank accounts. I told him the document was a forgery, that the notary stamp was fake. That was when they brought out the file on me." I slammed my fist onto the table, making the spoons rattle. "Those thieves. They are gutting the company." "It is worse than that," Frank said, grabbing my hand to quiet me. "They are cashing out. Julian has been talking to a competitor, Midwest Freight. He is trying to sell the heavy cargo fleet, the cranes and the flatbed trailers, for cash. They want to strip Vance Logistics of every asset of value, move the money to Panama, and then declare corporate bankruptcy here in Illinois. They are going to leave the company a hollow shell, fire all 200 drivers, and walk away with millions." "And me?" I asked, the image of the green dot card flashing in my mind. "What about me?" Frank looked at me with deep sorrow. "Julian has a doctor, Arthur, a psychiatrist named Dr. Lyle. He has already signed a preliminary evaluation declaring you incompetent due to vascular dementia. They are planning to use the forged power of attorney to place you in a state-funded care facility. Once you are locked away, they will have full guardianship. You won't be able to sue them, because legally, you won't exist in the eyes of the court. You will be a ward of the state under their control." I sat back in the booth, the air leaving my lungs. It was one thing to suspect greed. It was another to hear the clinical details of your own destruction. My wife of 42 years and the son I had raised were planning to lock me in an asylum to steal my life's work. "I saved some files, Arthur," Frank whispered. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small USB drive and slid it across the table, covering it with his hand. Before they blocked my administrative access, I downloaded the system logs. It shows the forged signatures and the draft contract for the fleet sale. It is not enough to stop them on its own, but it is a start. Take it, but be careful. If Julian finds out you have this, he will call the police and claim you stole proprietary corporate data. He will use it as proof that you are erratic. I took the USB drive and slid it into the inner pocket of my jacket next to the green dot card. Thank you, Frank, I said. I am going to fix this. Don't go to the family attorney, Arthur, Frank warned. He is in their pocket. He is the one who helped them modify the power of attorney. Find someone else, someone outside the circle. I nodded. I know exactly who to call. Go home, Frank. Keep your head down. I won't let them ruin you. I returned to the Lake Forest estate around 2 in the afternoon. The house was quiet, with only the hum of the central air conditioning breaking the silence. I stood in the driveway for a long moment, observing the empty spaces. Victoria's Lexus was gone. She had likely left for her weekly facial at the high-end spa downtown, a treatment that cost $300 and was paid for with my credit cards. Julian's Porsche was also absent. He was probably at some expensive steakhouse, pretending to be a brilliant young executive while spending company money. The house felt like a hollow shell, a monument to the greed of the people who lived inside it. I entered through the back door, stepping quietly onto the marble floors. I checked the upstairs hallway first. The heavy, rhythmic sound of Beatrice's snoring drifted from her suite at the end of the hall. She was fast asleep, likely napping off the effects of the expensive Chateau Margaux she had consumed the night before. I knew I had a window of maybe 2 hours before Victoria and Julian returned. It was not a lot of time, but I had spent my entire life working under tight deadlines in the logistics business. I walked down the hallway to my home office. The double oak doors, which I had carved and hung myself when we built the house 20 years ago, were shut tight. I reached for the brass handle and twisted it, but it did not budge. There was a new digital keypad lock installed on the handle, glowing with a small blue light. Julian had put it there to keep me out of my own office. He thought a battery-operated toy would protect his secrets. He forgot that I was a builder. He forgot that I knew exactly how these door frames were constructed because I had framed them with my own calloused hands. I walked back out to the garage, past my vintage Mercedes-Benz. I touched the hood of the car, feeling the cold, smooth metal. I had spent 3 years restoring that car, block by block, bolt by bolt. It was my sanctuary, the only place in this house where they could not touch me. Now Julian was talking about selling it to buy a new Porsche. I gritted my teeth and walked to my workbench. I grabbed a thin, flathead screwdriver and a small pry bar. I returned to the office door, my pulse steady. I wedged the flathead screwdriver into the tight gap between the solid oak door and the frame, right near the latch mechanism. I applied pressure, feeling the wood give slightly. With a quick practiced thrust of the pry bar, the latch popped out of the strike plate with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. The door swung open. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The office smelled different. It used to smell of old paper, leather, and my favorite tobacco. Now it smelled of Julian's cheap, heavy cologne and stale energy drinks. I walked to my mahogany desk, the desk I had imported from England 30 years ago. The surface was cluttered with printed spreadsheets, invoices, and empty coffee mugs. I tried the drawers, locked. Julian had locked every single drawer. I did not hesitate. I positioned the flathead screwdriver under the lip of the top right drawer. I did not care about the varnish or preserving the wood. This desk was just wood and metal. My survival and my dignity were the only things that mattered now. I pushed down on the pry bar, using my weight. There was a loud splintering sound as the lock mechanism snapped and the mahogany gave way. I pulled the drawer open. Inside was a mess of paperwork. At first glance, it looked like standard operations, fuel tax filings, payroll summaries, and route logistics sheets. But I knew Julian. He was sloppy and he was arrogant. He would not expect me to break into the office, so he would keep his most sensitive documents close. I reached to the very back of the drawer, beneath a stack of old blueprints of our first logistics warehouse. My fingers brushed against a thick, heavy manila envelope. It had no label. I pulled it out and opened it. The first document made my blood run cold. It was a draft for a reverse mortgage on the Lake Forest estate. The loan value was set at $3,100,000, which was almost the entire equity of the property. The estate was supposed to be the legacy I left to my grandchildren, but they were planning to cash it out. The disbursement date was scheduled for next week, and the application list showed Victoria and Julian as the co-signers, utilizing the power of attorney. I flipped the page. The next document was a letter from a law firm in Panama City. The letterhead read Castillo and Partners. The subject line was Asset Liquidation and Foreign Transfer. I read the words, but my brain refused to accept them at first. The letter outlined a detailed schedule for selling the heavy machinery of Vance Logistics, our flatbeds, our heavy-haul trailers, and our cranes, to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands called Vance Holdings, LLC. The purchase price was listed as $1,200,000, which was a fraction of the actual value of the fleet. The sole beneficiary of that Cayman shell company was Julian Vance. They were stripping the company for parts like a stolen car in a chop shop. They had no intention of running the business. They knew they were incompetent, so they were going to sell everything I had built, move the cash offshore, and let the company declare bankruptcy in the United States. I felt a wave of nausea. This was not just a financial takeover, it was the murder of my reputation and the destruction of the livelihoods of 200 drivers who trusted me. I leaned against the desk, my hands shaking. I had spent my life building a name that stood for reliability and trust, and my family was preparing to leave it in the gutter while they ran away with the spoils. I held the Panama documents in my hands, the paper feeling thin and cheap under my fingers. The ink was fresh, and the names typed on the lines were all too familiar. Victoria Vance, Julian Vance, and beneath their names was a line that made my chest tighten. Arthur Vance by Victoria Vance, power of attorney. They had registered Vance Holdings LLC in Panama City 3 months ago. The articles of incorporation listed Julian as the managing director and Victoria as the majority shareholder. But it was the next document in the stack that truly made my blood boil. It was a transfer of ownership agreement. According to this document, I, Arthur Vance, was voluntarily transferring all my personal shares in Vance Logistics, representing 60% of the company, to this newly formed Panama LLC for the sum of $1. $1. The agreement was dated June 14th of this year. I looked at the signature line at the bottom. The name Arthur Vance was written in a flowing cursive hand that looked remarkably like my own. At first glance, even I would have sworn I signed it. The slant of the letters, the pressure on the ink, the spacing between the first and last name, it was nearly perfect. But as I stared at the signature, my eyes caught a tiny detail. The tail of the letter in Arthur had a slight upward curl. I fell back into the leather chair, a memory flashing in my mind. 15 years ago, when Julian was a teenager, he used to practice my signature as a party trick. He would sign my name on school permission slips and report cards, laughing about how he could fool the teachers. I had caught him once and scolded him, but he had laughed it off, saying, "Look, Dad, I can sign your checks for you when you're old and lazy." I remembered noticing back then that he always curled the tail of the year upward. I never did. My year was always flat, a sharp, straight line. He had practiced my signature for 15 years. This was not a sudden decision made during my recent health scare. They had been planning this corporate heist for years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. I turned my attention to the reverse mortgage documents on the Lake Forest estate. The mortgage application was processed through a private lending firm in Delaware. I scanned the pages until I found the property deed. It was a warranty deed purporting to transfer the entire ownership of the Lake Forest property from my name into Victoria's sole name, citing a marital gift. The date on the deed was September 12, 2024. I stared at that date. September 12, 2024 was the exact day I was admitted to the Chicago General Hospital after suffering a mild stroke. I was in the intensive care unit, heavily medicated and barely conscious, unable to hold a pen, let alone sign a warranty deed. They had stood over my hospital bed, or perhaps sat in this very office, forging my name on a deed to steal the home I had built for them while I was fighting for my life. I felt a cold, hard rage begin to replace the shock. In Illinois, a forged deed is void from the beginning, a doctrine known as void ab initio. They thought they had legally secured the house, but they had actually committed a felony under Illinois law. 720 ILCS 517-3 which defines forgery as a Class 3 felony. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cheap burner smartphone I had purchased with cash yesterday. I turned on the camera, my hands completely steady now. I aligned the phone over the Panama Incorporation files. Click. I took a photo. I swiped to the transfer of ownership agreement, focusing on the forged signature and the curled R. Click. I photographed the warranty deed with the date, showing September 12, 2024. Click. I went through the envelope page by page, taking clear, high-resolution photos of every single document, every signature, and every bank account routing number. I made sure the lighting was perfect, utilizing the desk lamp. I took photos of a bank statement showing a wire transfer of $1,500, zero from our joint retirement account to an escrow account at a private bank in Panama. The transfer had been authorized by Victoria using the power of attorney. I was about to put the papers back when I noticed a separate, smaller envelope tucked into the side pocket of the drawer. I pulled it out. Inside was a draft agreement with Dr. Lyle, the psychiatrist Victoria had mentioned in her emails. The agreement outlined a schedule for a home clinical evaluation of Arthur Vance. Dr. Lyle was to receive a fee of $15. Zerozine for a diagnostic report stating that I was suffering from advanced stages of senile dementia and was incapable of making financial or personal decisions. The evaluation was scheduled for the 25th of this month. That was only 10 days away. 10 days before they declared me legally dead in the eyes of the law and locked me away in a state-funded warehouse for the forgotten elderly. I took photos of the psychiatrist's agreement and the payment receipt. I had all the evidence I needed to prove their conspiracy. It was not just asset dissipation, it was financial exploitation of an elderly person under Illinois Criminal Code 720 ILCS 51756. A Class 1 felony when the value of the property taken exceeds $100,000. I carefully returned the documents, the manila envelope, arranged them exactly as I had found them, and placed the envelope back under the blueprints. I pushed the drawer shut, aligning the splintered wood as best as I could. I turned off the desk lamp, stepped out of the office, and closed the doors. As I walked down the hallway, the grandfather clock in the foyer struck 3. I had less than an hour before Victoria returned from the spa. I needed to get out of the house. I needed to find a safe place to review the files Frank had given me on the USB drive. I walked out the back door of the estate, slipped through the side gate, and made my way down the street just as the sky began to gray with low-hanging clouds. I did not take the bus this time. I walked to a small coffee shop about a mile away, bought a cheap black coffee with my cash, and sat in the back corner. I pulled out my burner phone and checked the photos I had taken. The evidence was clear, but I needed to see what was on the USB drive Frank had given me. I left the coffee shop and walked another half-mile to the Lake Forest Public Library. It was quiet, filled with the scent of old paper and the soft tapping of keyboards. I found a public computer in the back, sat down, and inserted Frank's USB drive. The folders on the drive were neatly organized, a testament to Frank's decades of meticulous bookkeeping. I opened the first folder, labeled Vance Logistics System Logs. The logs contained digital footprints of the corporate portal. I scrolled through the entries from the past 2 weeks. There were multiple administrative logins from Jason's account, executing commands late at night. He had altered the corporate bylaws to remove the requirement for a physical board vote on asset sales. He had also uploaded a digital copy of the modified power of attorney to the bank's portal, which was what allowed them to lock me out of the operational accounts. I opened the second folder, labeled Midwest Freight Agreement. Inside was the actual contract Julian had drafted to sell our heavy transport fleet. It was a purchase agreement for 50 flatbeds, 12 heavy-duty cranes, and 30 freight trucks. The buyer was Midwest Freight, a competitor that had been trying to push us out of Chicago for a decade. The sale price was listed as $1,200,000. I stared at the number. The market value of that fleet was at least $6,000. Julian was selling it for pennies because the contract had a side clause. The buyer agreed to pay an additional $3,000, Zerozine cash consulting fee, to an offshore account in Panama under the name of Vance Holdings LLC. It was a blatant kickback scheme. Julian was selling my company's assets to a competitor, taking a massive bribe, and leaving the American company to drown in debt and declare bankruptcy. The closing date for the sale was set for the 28th of this month. That was only 3 days after the psychiatrist, Dr. Lyle, was scheduled to declare me incompetent. The timeline was perfect. They would lock me away on the 25th, close the sale on the 28th, transfer the cash to Panama, and file for bankruptcy by the 1st of next month. I was about to close the drive when I noticed a folder at the very bottom labeled Family Insurance Archive. It seemed out of place among the corporate financial files. I opened it. Inside were old medical records and health insurance applications for our family from 20 years ago. Frank, as CFO, had managed the company's group health insurance plan, and he had saved the old archives before the system was modernized. I opened a file labeled Julian Vance Medical. It was a copy of a blood panel report from when Julian was 18, required for a college sports insurance waiver. I scrolled down to the lab results. My eyes stopped on a line near the top. Blood type AB positive. I stared at the letters on the glowing screen. AB positive. My mind went back to my own medical records. IMO negative. It is a rare blood type, the universal donor, and I have donated blood dozens of times over my life. Victoria is O positive. I knew this because she had required a transfusion during a minor surgery years ago. I sat in the quiet library, the hum of the computer fan suddenly sounding like a jet engine in my ears. I am O negative. Victoria is O positive. In basic genetics, 2 parents with type O blood can only pass on type O genes to their offspring. They do not possess the A or B alleles. It is a biological impossibility for an O negative father and an O positive mother to have a child with type AB blood. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Julian was not my son. For 38 years, I had raised him. I had stayed up with him when he had fevers. I had paid for his private schools. I had bailed him out of trouble when he crashed his first car. I had given him a vice president title at my company, a job he was entirely unqualified for, because I believed he was my flesh and blood. I had tolerated his laziness and his disrespect because he was my son, but he was a stranger. Victoria had lied to me from the very beginning. She had married me, a hard-working young man with a single truck, and let me spend 4 decades breaking my back to build a life of luxury for her and another man's child. And now, that child and my wife were plotting to lock me in an asylum to steal the rest of my money. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against the edge of the library table. I closed my eyes, my breathing shallow. The pain of the financial betrayal was nothing compared to the deep, hollow void that opened in my chest. 38 years of fatherhood wiped away by a single line on a medical lab report. But as I sat there in the dim light of the library, the pain began to change. It hardened. The grief turned into a cold, absolute resolve. The last trace of hesitation, the last lingering doubt about whether I should show mercy to my family, vanished. They were not my family. They were vultures. I pulled out my burner phone, connected it to the computer, and copied the entire contents of the USB drive, including the insurance archives, onto the phone's encrypted storage. I ejected the USB drive, slipped it back into my pocket, and shut down the computer. I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and walked out of the library. The rain had started, a cold autumn drizzle that slicked the Chicago streets. I did not feel the cold. I felt like a man who had died and been reborn with a single purpose. I was going to destroy them, and I was going to use their own greed to do it. I left the library and caught a different bus heading south, toward the older, industrial section of Chicago. The rain was coming down harder now, washing grease and oil into the storm drains. I got off near a row of run-down brick buildings that had survived the city's gentrification. I walked down a narrow alley to a basement entrance with a peeling wooden sign that read Peterson and Associates Forensic Accounting and Legal Consulting. I pushed the door open. A small bell chimed, and I stepped down into a room packed from floor to ceiling with green banker boxes. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, dust, and cheap cigars. Behind a massive metal desk covered in spreadsheets sat a man with thick glasses and a messy gray beard. It was Marcus Peterson. He was 65 years old, a retired state investigator who had spent his career tracking white-collar criminals. He had a reputation for being ruthless, independent, and possessing a deep grudge against the large corrupt corporate law firms that dominated downtown Chicago. I had helped him 10 years ago by providing logistics tracking logs that exposed an insurance fraud ring operating out of a warehouse in Cicero. He had told me then that if I ever needed a favor, his door was open. Peterson looked up, squinting through his thick lenses. "Arthur Vance," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I heard you were living the high life in Lake Forest. You look like you just got caught in a Chicago downpour." "I did," I said, sliding into a creaking vinyl chair across from his desk. "And I just got thrown out of my own company." Peterson took off his glasses and cleaned them on his tie. "I heard rumors that Julian was taking over the day-to-day operations." "What happened?" I did not answer with words. I pulled out my burner phone, connected it to his desk monitor using a cable from my pocket, and opened the folder containing the photos I had taken. "Take a look at these," I said. Peterson leaned forward, putting his glasses back on. He scrolled through the photos of the reverse mortgage draft, the Cayman Shell Company transfer, and the forged warranty deed. As he read the letter from the Panama law firm, his eyebrows shot up. "This is a complete asset strip," Peterson muttered, his eyes darting across the screen. "They are gutting Vance Logistics and moving the cash offshore. And this deed, the date is September 12th, 2024? That was the day I was in the ICU recovering from a stroke," I said, my voice cold. Peterson shook his head, a low whistle escaping his lips. "That is a Class 3 felony under Illinois law 720 ILCS 5173, which covers forgery. In this state, a forged deed is void ab initio, meaning it has no legal effect from the moment it was created. They do not own that house, Arthur. They never did. But if they secure the reverse mortgage and the bank disperses the funds, the money will be gone to Panama before the court can even issue an injunction." I swiped to the next photo, showing the agreement with Dr. Lyle. Peterson's face hardened. "Dr. Lyle. I know him. He is a bought and paid for psychiatrist. The state board has investigated him twice for signing off on guardianship scams. This is elder financial abuse, Arthur. Under Illinois Criminal Code 720 ILCS 51756, because the value of the assets exceeds $100,000, it is a Class 1 felony. They are looking at 15 years in state prison just for this." "There is more," I said. I opened the folder containing the family insurance archive file I had copied from the library computer. I pointed to the blood typing lab report for Julian Vance. "Julian's blood type is AB positive. My blood type is O negative. Victoria's is O positive." Peterson stared at the screen, then looked up at me. His expression was a mixture of shock and deep sympathy. He was a smart man. He understood the biology immediately. "Arthur, two type O parents cannot have an AB child. It is physically impossible. You are not his biological father." "I know," I said, my voice steady. "I found out today." Peterson took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. The wood groaned under his weight. "This changes the entire legal strategy, Arthur. If Julian is not your biological son, and we check the original terms of the Vance family trust, we might have a massive leverage point." "Do you have a copy of the trust agreement?" "I do," I said. "Frank helped me draft it 15 years ago. The trust explicitly states that the beneficiaries must be my biological descendants. I wanted to protect the legacy from any future stepchildren or outsiders. Frank kept the original copy in his personal safe at home because he did not trust Victoria's lawyers." Peterson's eyes lit up behind his thick glasses. "If the trust specifies biological descendants, then Julian has zero legal standing to receive any trust assets. Any transfer of funds from the trust to him or to a shell company controlled by him is a direct breach of trust and constitutes wire fraud and theft on a massive scale. It means the modified power of attorney they used to transfer the assets is legally invalid because the beneficiary of the transfers is an unrelated third party." "So what do we do?" I asked. "Do we call the police now?" Peterson leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "No. If we call the police today, Julian's lawyers will tie this up in probate and civil courts for years. They will argue that the blood test is old, that the signature was authorized, and they will freeze all company operations. In the meantime, Julian will find a way to move the liquid assets through Panama and disappear. We need to catch them in the act of committing a federal crime." "A trap?" I asked. Peterson smiled, a grim, toothy grin. A trap. We let them proceed with their plan. We let them think they have won. We let them bring Dr. Lyle to your house on the 25th. We let Julian sign the contract with Midwest Freight on the 28th. But we will be recording everything. We will have GPS tracking on the trucks, forensic accounting, tracking the wire transfers in real time, and the FBI waiting at the other end of the transaction. We will catch them at the exact moment the money moves. That is when we strike. We need the original trust document, Arthur, Peterson said, tapping his fingers on the desk. The copy Victoria's lawyers might have been altered or destroyed by now. Do you know where Frank keeps it? Yes, I replied. Frank has a wall safe in his study. I will go to his house in Arlington Heights and get it. I left Peterson's office and took the bus back north, heading to Frank's modest brick house. The rain was finally letting up, leaving the streets damp and reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. When I arrived, Frank was waiting for me. He looked relieved to see me, but his hands were shaking as he poured me a cup of tea. We sat in his study, a room filled with old industry awards and photos of us standing next to our first flatbed truck. I explained what Peterson had said. Without a word, Frank walked to his study, moved a framed photo of his late wife, and opened the small digital wall safe. He pulled out a thick binder bound in blue leather and handed it to me. Here it is, Arthur, Frank said, his voice soft. The original, signed and notarized 15 years ago. Victoria never got her hands on this one. I kept it safe because I always had a bad feeling about her family. I opened the binder and flipped to section 4. There it was in plain English. Upon the death or incapacitation of the grantor, Arthur Vance, the trust assets shall be distributed solely to the grantor's biological descendants. In the event that no biological descendants exist, the assets shall go to the American Veteran Foundation. I closed the binder, a bitter smile on my face. Victoria's greed had blinded her. She had been so focused on using the power of attorney to grab the cash that she had completely forgotten about the biological descendant clause we had written into the core trust. Julian was legally an outsider. Under Illinois law, he had no more right to that trust than a stranger off the street. I took the binder back to Peterson's office. The next morning, Peterson spent 2 hours reviewing the document, comparing it to the system logs and the Panama paperwork. This is gold, Arthur, Peterson said, leaning back in his chair. Julian is toast, but we need to make sure we capture the electronic trail of the fraud. I have a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, a special agent named Miller. I am going to call him in. While Peterson made the call, he set up a laptop on his desk. Using the administrative credentials Frank had saved on the USB drive, Peterson logged into the Vance Logistics secure server. Because Julian and Jason had not yet changed the root server administrative passwords, we were able to mirror the accounting system directly onto Peterson's laptop. Look at this, Peterson said, pointing to the screen. A series of small pending transactions was highlighted in yellow. They are running test transfers. $1,000 yesterday, $5,000 today. They are sending it to the Panama account at Banco de Istmo. They are verifying the routing numbers before they execute the final $4,000 transfer. Can we block them? I asked. We could, Peterson replied. But if we do, Julian will know the system is compromised. He will immediately change the root passwords, lock us out, and find another way to move the money. We have to let the transactions go through, Arthur. We need the FBI to see the completed wire transfer. Once the money hits Panama, it constitutes federal wire fraud, 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. That is a federal offense with a maximum penalty of 20 years. Peterson's phone rang. He spoke in a low, hushed voice for 10 minutes, nodding several times. When he hung up, he looked at me with a serious expression. Agent Miller is on board. The FBI will monitor the Panamanian account under a federal warrant. They will also coordinate with the Illinois Department of Aging's Adult Protective Services Division regarding Dr. Lyle. We are going to let them perform the psychiatric evaluation on the 25th. I have to let that doctor evaluate me? I asked, my chest tightening. Yes, Peterson said, but we will turn it against them. I am going to install a hidden camera and a high-definition audio recorder in your home study. We will capture Dr. Lyle on tape accepting a bribe or writing a fraudulent report while you are clearly lucid. We will have him trapped, along with Victoria and Julian. Peterson leaned forward, his eyes serious. But Arthur, you must play the part. When you go back to that house, you cannot let them suspect that you know anything. You must behave exactly as they expect. Be quiet, be slightly confused, and let them think their allowance and their insults have broken your spirit. If you show any anger or strength, they will panic and pull the trigger early. Can you do that? I looked at the blue leather binder on the desk. I thought about the 42 years of marriage, the 38 years of raising a son who was not mine, and the smug laughter at the dinner table. I can do it, Peterson, I said, my voice quiet but hard. I will play the confused old man. I will let them think they have won. I took the bus back to Lake Forest and entered the house with a slow, shuffling gait. Victoria was in the living room. I pretended to look for my glasses, which were resting on my forehead. She watched me with a look of disgusted satisfaction, convinced that the stress was finally rotting my brain. "Arthur, your glasses are on your head," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "I think you need to go rest. You are becoming a burden to us." "Yes, dear," I mumbled, shuffling up the stairs, my head down. As I reached the safety of the guest room, I let the blank look slip from my face, replaced by a cold, sharp grin. The game was set. Although the blood-type logs on the server were a mathematical certainty, Peterson warned me that a court would require a modern certified DNA test to invalidate Julian's standing under the Vance family trust. "We need physical proof. Arthur," Peterson had said, "a chain of custody certified DNA test. Collect something with his saliva or hair. We will run it through a private lab I use for estate disputes." The opportunity came 2 days later. Julian had come home early, parking his Porsche in the driveway and marching into my office to retrieve a folder. He was drinking a cup of coffee from a local shop, setting it down on the kitchen counter while he argued with Victoria about the logistics fleet sale. After they went upstairs to Victoria's sitting room, I walked into the kitchen. The cardboard coffee cup was still sitting on the counter, a faint smudge of saliva on the plastic lid. I slipped on a pair of rubber gloves I kept under the sink, carefully placed the plastic lid into a clean Ziploc bag, and put it in my pocket. I threw the cardboard cup in the trash so Julian would not notice the lid was missing. I took the bus downtown to a private medical lab Peterson had recommended, located in a quiet medical building near Rush University. I paid $400 in cash, money Frank had lent me from his personal savings, for an expedited, certified paternity test. I submitted my own cheek swab and handed the technician the Ziploc bag containing Julian's coffee lid. The technician was cold and professional, sealing the bag with tamper-evident tape. They promised the results in 5 business days. During those 5 days, the tension in the Lake Forest estate became almost unbearable. I had to live under the same roof with the woman who had lied to me for 42 years and the man who had stolen my identity, all while pretending to be a helpless, senile old man. I sat at the breakfast table, shuffling my feet and staring blankly at my plate while Victoria and Beatrice spoke about me, as if I were already gone. "He is declining so fast," Beatrice whispered, not even bothering to lower her voice. "Look at him. He can barely hold his fork." "The evaluation next week cannot come soon enough, Victoria. We need to get him into that facility before he does something erratic with the remaining property deeds." "I know, Mother," Victoria replied, sipping her orange juice. "Dr. Lyle has assured me the paperwork will be processed immediately. We just need to make sure Arthur does not leave the house." "Julian, did you tell the gate guards not to let his old Mercedes out?" Julian, who was reading a brochure at the other end of the table, looked up. "Yeah, the keys are in my desk. We should call the vintage car dealer next week. I already have a buyer lined up who will give us $80,000 cash for it. It will help cover Dr. Lyle's fee and the initial deposit for the care home." I looked down at my plate, my fingers gripping the fork. I wanted to stand up, grab the crystal juice decanter, and smash it across Julian's face. I wanted to tell him that he was a fraud, that he was not my son, and that he was going to prison, but I forced my hands to relax. I let my jaw slacken, letting a tiny drop of saliva pool at the corner of my mouth. I wiped it with my sleeve, looking confused. "The Mercedes," I mumbled, my voice trembling slightly. "I need to check the spark plugs. The spark plugs are dirty." Julian laughed, a condescending snort. "Sure, Dad, we'll check the spark plugs later. Why don't you go sit in the garden? The sun is nice today. I stood up, letting my shoulders slump, and shuffled out of the dining room. As I walked past Julian, my eyes caught the brochure he was reading. It was a glossy catalog for a luxury yacht, the price circled in red ink, $12,000. Next to the photo in Julian's handwriting were the words, Freedom, ETA 30 days. They were already spending the money they expected to make from liquidating my life's work. 30 days. That was their timeline. That was how long they thought I had waved and sailed off into the sunset. On the 5th day, I received a notification on my burner phone. The DNA results were ready. I took the bus to a private post office box Peterson had set up for me under a fake name. The clerk handed me a plain white envelope. My hands, which had remained steady through the entire ordeal, shook slightly as I tore open the seal. I pulled out the document, my eyes scanning past the technical jargon and the genetic marker tables until I reached the conclusion at the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. The alleged father, Arthur Vance, is excluded as the biological father of the child, Julian Vance. I stared at the number, 0.00%. It was the final, absolute truth. The last remaining doubt was gone. The boy I had loved, the boy I had built an empire for, was a stranger. I folded the certified document, placed it in the inner pocket of my jacket next to the USB drive, and walked out into the cold Chicago afternoon. I called Peterson on the burner phone. I have the results, I said. It is 0%. Excellent, Peterson replied, his gravelly voice sounding like music to my ears. That is the lock on the cage, Arthur. Now we wait for the 25th. Dr. Lyle is coming to your house for the evaluation. I checked Victoria's social calendar. Tomorrow night, she, Julian, and Beatrice are attending the annual charity gala at the Lake Forest Country Club. They will be gone for at least 4 hours. That gives me the perfect window to come over and install the hidden cameras in your study. Be ready. The next evening, the Lake Forest estate was empty. Victoria, Julian, and Beatrice had dressed in their finest attire and departed for the Lake Forest Country Club charity gala. I watched their cars roll down the driveway, the taillights disappearing into the damp Chicago night. At 8, a nondescript white utility van pulled up to the side gate. I walked down the driveway and unlocked the gate, letting Peterson inside. He was carrying a small black tool bag. We walked quietly into the house, heading straight for my home office. Peterson wasted no time. He pulled out 2 tiny pinhole cameras, no larger than a coat button, and a small cellular hotspot device. He mounted the first camera on the top shelf of the oak bookshelf, wedged between 2 thick manuals on commercial transport regulations. The camera had a perfect wide-angle view of the desks and the chairs in front of it. He hidden the second camera inside the casing of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room, positioning the lens through a tiny decorative gap in the wooden scrollwork. He placed the cellular transmitter inside the bottom of the clock, running the power cord behind the baseboard. They won't see them, Peterson whispered, checking the feed on his tablet. The resolution is 1080p with crystal clear audio. It streams directly to an encrypted server that Agent Miller and I can access. Anything Dr. Lyle says in this room will be recorded in high definition. While Peterson was finalizing the connections, I walked down to the basement. The basement was dry and finished, but at the back, behind the wine cellar, was a utility room filled with old storage boxes. These boxes contained Victoria's personal archives from our early years of marriage, items she had refused to throw away but had hidden from sight. Now that I knew the truth about Julian's paternity, I wanted to understand how it had happened. I wanted to know if Victoria had made a mistake or if it had been a calculated choice from the beginning. I found a dusty blue plastic bin labeled Victoria Personal, 1986-1988. The dust on the box left gray streaks on my suit, and the plastic handle cracked as I popped the lid off. Inside were old photo albums, greeting cards, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded red ribbon. I took the letters to the small utility table and turned on the overhead bulb. I untied the ribbon. The letters were written on thin yellowed paper that still carried a faint, stale scent of Victoria's old lavender perfume, written in Beatrice's distinctive, sharp handwriting. I opened the first letter, dated June 12, 1987. My eyes scanned the elegant cursive. "Victoria, you must act quickly," Beatrice wrote. "Donald has made it clear he has no intention of marrying you or supporting the child. He is a drifter and has no future. If you remain in that apartment, the scandal will ruin us. You must focus on Arthur. He is a good man, he is hard-working, and his transport business is already expanding. He is foolishly in love with you and is too busy working to ask questions. If you marry him before the end of the summer, he will believe the child is his. He will provide the secure, wealthy life Donald never could. Do not hesitate." I read the words again, my fingers turning cold. I looked at the next letter, dated July 5, 1987. "Arthur has already agreed to the wedding date in August. You did well. Once the marriage certificate is signed, the child will be legally his. Make sure you play the part of the devoted wife. Let him work his 18-hour days. It keeps him out of the house and ensures he will never suspect the truth. We will have the security we deserve." I stood in the dusty basement, the letters paper rattling in my hands. It was a cold-blooded blueprint. They had targeted me like a mark in a con game. I was not a husband, I was a financial utility. I was the mule they used to carry their weight for 4 decades while they mocked my work ethic behind my back. I felt a sudden, profound sense of release. The pain that had been weighing on my chest since I saw the DNA report vanished, replaced by a cold vacuum-like clarity. My entire marriage had been a transaction. My son was a biological stranger inserted into my life to secure my wealth. I pulled out my burner phone and took photos of every single letter, ensuring the dates, signatures, and Beatrice's handwriting were perfectly legible. I tied the letters back with the red ribbon, returned them to the plastic bin, and placed the lid back on. I walked back upstairs to the study. Peterson had finished his work, packing his tools back into his bag. He looked at me, noticing the change in my expression. "You look like you saw a ghost, Arthur." "I did," I said, showing him the photos of the letters on my phone. "I saw the ghost of my marriage. It was a scam from day one, Peterson. Victoria and her mother planned the whole thing before Julian was even born." Peterson scrolled through the letters, his jaw tightening. "This is incredible, Arthur. In a divorce proceeding, this evidence of fraud from the inception of the marriage will be devastating. Victoria won't get a single penny of maintenance. The court will view her conduct as a decades-long fraudulent scheme. We will dismantle her entire financial world." "Good," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "Let's make sure the cameras work." Peterson tapped his tablet, showing me the live feed of the study. The image was sharp, capturing every detail of the desk and the grandfather clock. "We are live, Arthur. The feed is secure. Dr. Lyle is coming in 3 days. Play the part of the confused old man for just a little longer. The trap is ready to spring." Over the next 3 days, I became a master actor. I knew that if I wanted the trap to spring perfectly, I had to make Victoria and Julian absolutely certain that their plan was working. I had to feed their arrogance, letting them believe my mind was slipping away like sand through an hourglass. I started with small, calculated mistakes. At breakfast, I would stare at my plate for 5 minutes, then look up at Victoria with a blank expression. "Did I eat breakfast already, dear? I cannot seem to remember." Victoria would exchange a pleased, subtle glance with Julian before answering in a patronizing, sweet voice. "Yes, Arthur, you ate. You had your eggs. Why don't you go sit in the study?" I would nod, shuffling my feet as I walked away. In my study, I made sure to leave doors open so they could hear me. I would call out for employees who had retired a decade ago. "George?" I would call out, my voice cracking slightly. "Where is George? We have to load the flatbeds for the Indiana route. The shipment is late." George had been our yard manager and had retired 10 years ago to Arizona. One afternoon, Julian walked into the study while I was doing this. He stood in the doorway, watching me with a smug, satisfied expression. "Dad, George doesn't work here anymore," Julian said, his voice flat. "He retired, remember?" "Retired?" I repeated, scratching my head and letting my eyes wander around the room. But who is going to check the manifests? We have 10 loads of steel going to Gary, Indiana." "Don't worry about it, Dad," Julian said, walking over and patting my shoulder. It was the first time he had touched me in months, and it made my skin crawl. "I am handling the steel. You just relax. You don't need to worry about Gary anymore." "Okay," I mumbled, sitting down in my chair and staring at the empty desk. Okay, Julian, you are a good boy. As soon as he turned his back and walked out, my blank stare vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I looked up at the bookshelf where Peterson's pinhole camera was hidden, knowing that every word of this interaction was being recorded and uploaded to the FBI's secure server. Later that evening, I sat in the living room, reading the newspaper. I held it upside down for 20 minutes. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Victoria watching me from the hallway. She had her phone to her ear, speaking in a hushed whisper. Yes, Dr. Lyle, she said, her voice filled with a fake theatrical sorrow. He is declining rapidly. Today he was reading the paper upside down and asking for yard managers who retired a decade ago. It is heartbreaking to watch. Yes, the 25th is perfect. Please bring the guardianship declarations and the state competency forms. We need to finalize this before he becomes a danger to himself. She hung up and I saw her tap another number. Julian, it's me. I just spoke to Lyle. The evaluation is set for Thursday morning. Make sure Jason has the transfer authorizations ready. The moment Lyle signs the declaration, we will execute the wire transfer to Vance Holdings. We don't want the bank questioning the transaction if Arthur has a sudden lucid moment. Consider it done, I heard Julian's voice reply over the speakerphone. Jason is finalizing the paperwork with Midwest Freight. We will close the sale of the cargo fleet on the 28th, right after the guardianship is active. The money will be in Panama before the end of the week. I turned a page of the upside-down newspaper, my face completely expressionless. They were rushing. Just as Peterson had predicted, my apparent decline was making them reckless. They were moving their timeline forward, consolidating their fraud into a tight 3-day window. The next morning, Victoria brought me my daily medications in a small paper cup. It contained 2 blue and yellow capsules, mild sedatives she had been putting in my cup to make me look slow and sleepy when visitors came. As I walked to the kitchen to get a glass of water, I pretended to stumble. I dropped the cup, letting the capsules scatter across the tile floor. Oh, I am sorry, Victoria, I stammered, looking down at the floor in confusion. My hands, they are so stiff today. Victoria sighed, her face showing a brief flash of irritation before she smoothed it over. It is fine, Arthur. I will sweep them up. Just go sit in the garden. I walked out of the kitchen and sat on the wooden bench in the garden. The lake forest trees were turning gold and red, and the air carried the crisp scent of autumn leaves. I sat there in silence. I had not taken those pills in 3 days, spitting them into the toilet. Without the sedatives, my mind was sharper than it had been in years. That night, I received a text message on my burner phone from Peterson. The FBI has flagged the Panama accounts. They have also traced Dr. Lyle's personal bank logs. He received a $5,000 cash deposit yesterday, likely the first half of Victoria's bribe. We have the wiretap on his phone. Thursday is the day. Be ready to play your final scene. I deleted the message, took the battery out of the burner phone, and hid it back in my sock drawer. I stood by the glass window of the cold guest room, looking out at the dark Chicago skyline. The rain had stopped and the stars were visible through the cold autumn air. Thursday was the 25th, the day they planned to declare me legally dead and lock me in an asylum. I smiled a cold, silent smile in the dark. They thought they were building my coffin. They had no idea they were actually digging their own graves. I went to bed, sleeping soundly for the first time in weeks. It was Wednesday night, the evening before the evaluation. The air in the Lake Forest house was thick with anticipation. Victoria, Julian, and Beatrice had gathered in my home study, the office Julian had claimed as his own. They thought I was asleep in my room, sedated by the capsules they believed I had swallowed. Instead, I was awake. I sat in the dark of the guest room, looking at the glowing screen of my burner phone. Peterson had given me access to the live cellular feed from the pinhole cameras he had installed in the grandfather Clogger clock and the bookshelf. I put in my headphones, my breathing silent as the video feed loaded on the screen. The camera in the grandfather clock captured the entire room. Victoria was sitting on the leather sofa, a glass of wine in her hand. Julian was pacing back and forth, holding a folder. Beatrice sat in the high-backed leather chair, her expression cold and venomous. "Is the facility in Kankakee confirmed?" Beatrice asked, her voice cracking through the audio feed. Yes, grandmother, Julian replied, stopping his pacing. He tapped the folder. It is the Green Meadows Care Center in Kankakee. It is a state-funded facility. The beauty of it is that because it is state-funded, the cost is virtually zero to us once the guardianship is active. We don't have to spend a dime of our own cash to keep him there. It is a secure ward. The doors are locked, and the staff keeps the patients heavily medicated so they don't cause any trouble. It is the perfect place for him. Victoria took a slow sip of her wine, nodding in approval. And the security? I don't want him calling Frank or trying to contact any of his old business associates. He still has friends in the industry. I checked. Julian smiled, a cold, predatory grin. Because it is a low-end facility, the staff is underpaid and they don't ask questions. Once Dr. Lyle signs the declaration of severe cognitive decline, the court will grant us full guardianship. I will put Arthur on the restricted visitor list. No phone access, no internet, and no visitors without my physical signature. He will be completely isolated, and no one will ever hear from him again. Beatrice nodded, her diamond rings glittering in the light of the desk lamp. Good. He is a lower-class brute, Victoria. He always was. He spent 40 years covered in grease and dirt, worrying about his trucks. He belongs in a place like Kankakee. Let him rot there while we enjoy the fruits of his labor. How long will the asset transfer take once Lyle signs? Lyle will sign the papers tomorrow morning, Julian explained, leaning against my mahogany desk. I will scan the declaration directly to Jason at the office. Jason has the wire authorizations pre-loaded. He will execute the $4,000 transfer to Vance Holdings in Panama immediately. The bank's compliance officer won't be able to block it once we upload the certified guardianship order. By tomorrow afternoon, the liquid cash will be out of the country. And the fleet sale? Victoria asked. The representatives from Midwest Freight are meeting me at the office on Friday morning at 10, Julian said. We will sign the bill of sale for the heavy transport fleet. They will wire the $1,200,000 purchase price, and the $3,000 zero-zen consulting fee will be deposited directly into our Panama account. We will file for corporate bankruptcy on Monday morning. By the time the bankruptcy trustee checks the books, the company will have no assets, and the shell company in Panama will be legally shielded. What about the house? Beatrice asked. The reverse mortgage funds will be disbursed next Wednesday, Julian said. That is another $3,500,000. Once the mortgage cash hits Panama, we pack our bags. We will leave this house to the bank and move to the villa in Tuscany. Victoria, you can finally live the life you were meant to live. Victoria smiled, a look of pure, unadulterated greed on her face. It has been a long wait, Julian. 38 years of pretending to love a man who smelled of diesel fuel. I deserve this. My youth was wasted on his long hours and his boring truck talk. We all do, Julian said, raising his glass of wine in a toast. To freedom. I watched the screen as they clinked their glasses together, their laughter echoing through my headphones. My hand gripped the burner phone so hard the plastic casing creaked. I felt no pain, no sorrow, and no regret. The recording was absolute. Every detail of their plan, the names of the shell companies, the dates of the transactions, and the deliberate intent to abuse and isolate me, was captured in high-definition video and audio. I checked the cellular status bar on the screen. The entire stream had been successfully uploaded and saved to Peterson's server, with a duplicate copy sent directly to Agent Miller at the FBI. They had just confessed to a federal conspiracy of wire fraud, bank fraud, and elder abuse, all on tape. I took a deep breath, closed the app, and turned off the burner phone. I disassembled the phone, slipping the battery and the SIM card into a small notch in the guest room floorboards, ensuring they would never find it. I laid back on the bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the cold wind rustle the oak trees outside the window. Tomorrow was the 25th. Dr. Lyle would arrive at 9 in the morning. He would sit in my study, ask his loaded questions, and write his fraudulent report. I would let him do it. I would let him write the words that he thought would condemn me to Kankakee. The vultures were circling, thinking the carcass was ready. They did not know the lion was awake, and the hunters were already waiting in the trees. I closed my eyes and fell asleep, my mind perfectly at peace. Thursday morning arrived, cold and foggy. At 9 sharp, Dr. Lyle pulled up to the estate in a dark sedan. He was a small, balding man in a rumpled suit, carrying a leather briefcase. Victoria welcomed him with her rehearsed theatrical tears, guiding him into my study. Julian had brought me down and seated me in the chair in front of the mahogany desk. I sat there, my shoulders slumped, my chin tilted slightly downward, staring blankly at the polished wood. "Arthur," Dr. Lyle said, his voice dripping with professional concern. "Do you know what day of the week it is?" I blinked slowly, letting a long pause hang in the air before answering in a weak, slurred voice. It is Sunday. We need to go to church. Victoria, where's my Sunday suit?" Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Victoria smile. Dr. Lyle nodded, writing a note in his folder. "And do you know who this young man is standing next to you?" he asked, pointing to Julian. I squinted, looking at Julian in confusion. That is the boy who checks the tires. The yard boy. He is a good boy." Dr. Lyle leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Arthur, do you know who the President of the United States is?" I paused, looking up at the ceiling as if struggling to recall. "Eisenhower," I mumbled. "Dwight Eisenhower. He is a strong leader, a military man." Julian smirked, folding his arms. Dr. Lyle spent another 15 minutes asking loaded questions, each one designed to establish my cognitive decline. I played the part perfectly, mixing up dates, asking for George, and complaining about the cold. When he was finished, Dr. Lyle closed his folder. "It is a clear case of advanced vascular dementia," he said to Victoria. "He is entirely incapable of managing his affairs. I will sign the competency declaration and the guardianship recommendation immediately." "Thank you, Doctor," Victoria said, stepping forward. As she did, she reached into her purse and pulled out a thick, white envelope. She slid it across the mahogany desk, right in front of Dr. Lyle. "For your expedited service. I know how busy you are." Dr. Lyle did not hesitate. He picked up the envelope, peeked inside to check the thick stack of crisp $100 bills, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He patted it with a greasy smile. "Always glad to help a family in transition, Mrs. Vance." I watched the entire transaction, my head tilted down. The pinhole camera in the oak bookshelf had captured everything: the cash envelope, the signature on the fraudulent declaration, and the smug looks on their faces. Dr. Lyle signed the papers, packed his briefcase, and left. As soon as the front door closed, the speed of their heist accelerated. Julian grabbed the signed declaration, scanned it on the office printer, and sent it to Jason at the office. Within 30 minutes, Peterson, monitoring the server mirror from his basement office, saw the transaction execute. A wire transfer of $4,120,000 was initiated from Vance Logistics' main operating account to Banco de Istmo in Panama. The transfer was authorized by Julian Vance, utilizing the modified power of attorney backed by Dr. Lyle's fresh competency declaration. The FBI's Special Agent Miller was watching the transfer in real time. The money had officially crossed international borders, completing the federal crime of wire fraud. But Julian was not done. To prepare for the fleet sail to Midwest Freight on Friday morning, he had ordered the dispatchers to immediately move all 50 flatbeds, 12 cranes, and 30 freight trucks out of our Chicago yard. He wanted them hidden at a private storage facility across the state line in Gary, Indiana, so they could not be seized by the Illinois courts once the company filed for bankruptcy. It was a massive logistics operation, with drivers moving the heavy trucks under the cover of the midday fog. The rumble of the diesel engines was distant, but I knew the sound of my fleet by heart. Julian believed he was being clever, hiding the physical assets out of state. He forgot that when I modernized Vance Logistics 5 years ago, I had insisted on installing independent, hardwired GPS tracking units inside the frame of every single crane and flatbed trailer. These units were separate from the standard driver logs and were linked to a secure cloud account that only the founder could access. Julian, in his digital ignorance, did not even know they existed. I sat in my room, using my burner phone to log into the GPS portal. On the screen, I saw 50 red dots moving in a convoy down Interstate 94, crossing the Calumet River and the state line into Indiana, past the dark smokestacks of the steel mills. They were parking the fleet at a secluded, fenced warehouse yard in Gary. Each dot represented a piece of equipment I had purchased with my own hard-earned money over the last 40 years, equipment that had paid for Julian's private school and Victoria's luxury life. I had bought every single one of those trucks with my own sweat. I took screenshots of the real-time GPS coordinates, showing the truck numbers, the speed, and the exact destination. I forwarded the data directly to Peterson and Special Agent Miller. Julian was transporting fraudulently obtained corporate property across state lines, a violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 2314, which covers the interstate transportation of stolen goods. This was another federal felony that the FBI would enforce. The trap was fully loaded. The FBI had the wire transfer logs, the video of Dr. Lyle's bribe, and the real-time GPS tracking of the stolen fleet in Indiana. Victoria and Julian were in the kitchen pouring champagne. I could hear the pop of the cork and their laughter drifting up the stairs. They thought they had secured their escape to Italy. They had no idea that every red dot on my screen was a nail in their coffin. On Thursday night, I lay awake in the dark guest room. Downstairs, the house was quiet, but I knew the electronic wires were humming. The Panama wire transfer had settled, and the stolen logistics fleet was parked in the yard in Gary, Indiana. The evidence was complete. Early Friday morning, I slipped out of the house. I did not need to hide anymore. The evaluation was over, and they believed I was sedated and helpless. I caught a cab, paying with cash Frank had lent me, and rode down to Peterson's basement office. Peterson was already at his desk, surrounded by empty coffee cups. Beside him sat Special Agent Miller of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, a serious man in a dark blue suit with a gold badge clipped to his belt, and a representative from the Illinois Adult Protective Services named Linda. Peterson compiled all the gathered files into a final prosecution packet. The mirrored server transfer logs, the hidden camera video of Dr. Lyle's bribe, the GPS tracking coordinates of the fleet in Indiana, the DNA paternity report, the original Vance family trust agreement, showing Julian is not a biological descendant, and the old 1987 letters proving Victoria's premeditated fraud. Agent Miller spent 30 minutes reviewing the files on the computer screen. He was a tall, sharp-eyed investigator in his 40s who had built his career tracing complex corporate fraud. He examined the DNA report, the certified trust deed, and the video showing Dr. Lyle stuffing the cash envelope into his pocket. When he was finished, he took off his glasses and looked at me. "Mr. Vance," Agent Miller said, his voice grave. "In my 15 years with the Bureau, I have never seen a financial fraud case this clean. The evidence is absolute. We have a clear electronic trail of federal wire fraud under 18 U.S.C., Section 1343, and the transportation of stolen corporate assets across state lines under Section 2314. Combined with the state-level charges of elder financial exploitation and forgery, your family is facing decades in federal prison." Linda from Adult Protective Services nodded. "We have already contacted the state licensing board regarding Dr. Lyle. A warrant is being issued for his arrest as we speak. We are freezing his medical license immediately." "What about Julian and Victoria?" I asked, my voice steady. "The arrest warrants are being signed by a federal magistrate right now," Agent Miller said. "We also have a warrant to freeze the Panama bank account at Banco de Istmo. The Panamanian authorities are cooperating under our mutual legal assistance treaty. The $4,120,000 Julian transferred yesterday is locked. He won't be able to touch a single cent of it." Agent Miller checked his watch. It was 8:30 in the morning. Julian is scheduled to meet the representatives from Midwest Freight at the Vance Logistics headquarters at 10 this morning to sign the bill of sale for the cargo fleet. He expects to receive the $3,000 cash kickback. We are going to execute the arrest warrants directly in the corporate boardroom during that meeting. Miller looked at me, a faint smile on his face. "Mr. Vance, as the primary victim and the legal owner of the company, you have the right to be present. I think it would be appropriate for you to walk into that room and reclaim your business." "I will be there," I said, a cold, quiet anger settling in my chest. "And I am bringing Frank Miller with me." I called Frank on my burner phone. "Frank," I said, "put on your best suit. We are going back to the office." Frank's voice was shaking, but he did not hesitate. "I'll be ready in 15 minutes, Arthur." I walked to the small bathroom in Peterson's office, washed my face, and combed my gray hair. I put on my favorite charcoal suit, the same suit I had worn when security dragged me out of my building. I adjusted my tie, looking at my reflection in the mirror. I did not look like a senile old man anymore. I looked like Arthur Vance, the builder, the man who had started with a single truck and built an empire. At 9:30, Frank met me at the corner of the block. He was wearing his old executive suit, carrying his leather briefing case. The autumn wind was cold, blowing dry leaves across the Chicago streets. We walked toward the Vance Logistics building together. As we walked, we talked about the first warehouse we rented in Cicero, remembering the cold winters and the long nights. We felt a sense of finality. We were going back to our creation. Behind us, 3 unmarked black SUVs containing Agent Miller and his team of FBI agents followed at a distance. Tiffany, the new receptionist, was sitting behind the marble desk when Frank and I pushed through the glass doors. She looked up from her phone, her expression instantly turning hostile when she saw my face. She stood up, her long acrylic nails pointing at me. "I told you last time, Mr. Vance. You cannot be here. I am calling security." "Call them, Tiffany," I said, my voice echoing in the marble lobby. "Call them, but they won't be looking at me. They will be looking at the federal agents behind me." She froze as the front doors opened again and 6 FBI agents in windbreakers, with yellow letters spelling FBI, stepped into the lobby. Her face went pale, her phone slipping from her fingers onto the marble floor. At that moment, the 2 large security guards who had dragged me out of the building last Tuesday stepped out of the side hallway. They saw the yellow FBI letters, saw the badges, and immediately froze in their tracks. One of them raised his hands, stepping back. I looked at them, my voice calm. "Go stand in the corner," I said. "You are both fired." They did not argue. They walked to the side of the lobby, keeping their heads down. Frank and I, flanked by Agent Miller and the federal agents, stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The elevator chimed as we reached the 3rd floor. The doors slid open to the executive wing, a place of quiet carpet and wood-paneled walls. Frank and I walked down the hall, our heels clicking firmly on the floor. Flanking us were Agent Miller and 4 armed FBI agents. The door to the main corporate boardroom, which sat at the end of the corridor, was closed, but we could hear voices coming from inside. I pushed the heavy oak double doors open. The scene inside was exactly as Peterson had predicted. Julian was sitting at the head of the conference table, my chair, with a thick stack of contracts spread out in front of him. Next to him sat Victoria, dressed in a designer gray dress, looking like a queen who had just been crowned. Across from them sat 2 representatives from Midwest Freight, our biggest competitor, wearing expensive corporate suits. Jason, the weasel-like acting finance director, stood behind Julian, holding a pen. They were in the middle of signing the contract for the sale of my entire cargo fleet. Julian had just signed his name on the signature line, handing the pen to the lead representative from Midwest Freight, with Mr. Vance legally declared incompetent under our guardianship filings yesterday. Julian was saying, his voice filled with a smooth, false authority. "I have full power of attorney to execute this sale. The billing will be routed to Vance Holdings." He stopped speaking as the doors swung open and the heavy wood clicked against the wall. The entire room went dead silent. Victoria looked up, her wineglass stopping halfway to her mouth. When she saw me standing there, her eyes went wide and her face drained of color. Julian jumped up from my chair, his face turning red with anger. He looked past me, expecting the 2 security guards to appear. "Dad? What the hell are you doing here? You should be at home in bed. You are mentally incompetent. Who let him in?" "Jason, call security immediately." I stood in the doorway, my spine straight, my eyes fixed on my son. The slight shuffle in my walk was gone. The slurred voice and the blank stare were replaced by a cold, sharp presence. "The security guards won't be helping you today, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the large room, steady and powerful. "They have been fired, and I am not incompetent." "Arthur, listen to yourself," Victoria shrieked, standing up and smoothing her dress, though her hands were shaking. "You are shouting. You are having an episode. You are confused. We have a clinical evaluation from Dr. Lyle. You belong in a facility where you can be cared for." "Dr. Lyle won't be helping you either, Victoria." I said, stepping into the room. The Illinois State Police arrested him 30 minutes ago at his private clinic for bribery and filing fraudulent medical evaluations. The licensing board has revoked his medical license. His report is completely invalid. Julian scoffed, trying to maintain his tough executive act, though a bead of sweat was running down his temple. This is ridiculous. You are a crazy old man causing a scene. We have a legal power of attorney. We have the authority to sell these assets. Agent Miller stepped forward, pulling his gold badge from his pocket and holding it up for everyone in the room to see. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody move. Put the pens down and step away from the table. The two representatives from Midwest Freight immediately dropped their pens and raised their hands, their faces pale. "We don't want any part of this," the lead representative stammered. "We were told the sale was authorized. We have a certified copy of the power of attorney." "The power of attorney you have was obtained through fraud, forgery, and elder abuse," Agent Miller said, gesturing to the two agents behind him. "The transaction is a violation of federal law. The wire transfer of $4,120,000 to Panama yesterday has been flagged and frozen. The Panamanian government has locked the account. The assets you are attempting to sell are under a federal seizure order." Julian looked from Agent Miller to me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "No, that is impossible. The bank cleared it." "Jason, tell them the bank cleared it." Jason did not answer. He was trembling so hard he had dropped the pen, backing away toward the window. "Jason is going to prison, Julian," I said. "Just like you, Frank. Why don't you take your seat?" Frank Miller walked past Julian and sat down in the CFO's chair, placing his leather briefcase on the table. He opened it, pulled out a thick stack of printouts, and slid them across the polished wood. "These are the original server logs, Julian," Frank said, his voice steady and professional. "They show Jason's logins, the modified bylaws, and the forged signatures you uploaded. Every digital trace of your heist has been captured. We also have the GPS coordinates of the 50 flatbeds and cranes you tried to hide in Gary, Indiana. The Indiana State Police have already locked down the yard. The fleet is safe." Victoria sank back into her chair, her hands covering her face. She began to sob, a dry, pathetic sound. "Arthur, please, we did this for the family. We wanted to protect the inheritance. We love you." "You loved my money, Victoria," I said, looking down at her. "And you have spent the last 38 years pretending to love me. I know about Donald. I know about the letters from Beatrice in 1987. I know that Julian is not my son." Julian froze, his eyes going wide. He looked at Victoria, then back at me. "What? What are you talking about?" "I ran a DNA test, Julian," I said, pulling the certified lab report from my jacket pocket and tossing it onto the conference table. The paper slid across the wood and stopped in front of him. "You are 0%, my son. And under Section 4 of the Vance Family Trust, which Frank and I drafted 15 years ago, only my biological descendants have any right to the trust assets. You are legally a stranger to this company and this family." Julian stared at the DNA report, his fingers trembling as he picked up the paper. His eyes darted across the text, reading the certified conclusion over and over. 0%, he whispered, his voice cracking. He turned to Victoria, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. "Mom, is this true? Is this real? Who is Donald? Tell me this is a joke." Victoria did not look at him. She kept her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. Her silence was the loudest confession she could have made. Julian fell back into his chair, the paper slipping from his hands and fluttering to the floor. The arrogance that had defined him for 38 years vanished, leaving him looking hollow, broken, and suddenly nameless. He was not a Vance. He had no legacy. He was the son of a man who had abandoned his mother before he was even born. He realized that his entire life, his Ivy League degree, and his expensive Porsche were built on a lie. He had spent his life looking down on Arthur, believing he was superior, but Arthur was the only reason he had anything of value. "I raised you, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of 4 decades of labor. "I paid for your private schools and your Yale tuition. I bought you your houses, your cars, and your expensive Italian suits. I gave you a VP seat in this company that you did not earn. I did it all because I believed you were my son. But you are not. You are the child of a drifter named Donald, brought into my home through a calculated lie designed by Victoria and Beatrice before you were even born. Arthur, Victoria cried, lifting her tear-streaked face. She looked older now, the expensive facials and designer clothes unable to hide the desperation in her eyes. Please, we have been married for 42 years. You cannot do this to me. You cannot throw me to the wolves. We built a life together. You were the wolves, Victoria, I said, looking her in the eye. You and your mother. You stood in my kitchen and called me a freeloader. You drank my Chateau Margaux and laughed at my calloused hands. You planned to lock me in an asylum in Kankakee, heavily medicated and isolated, so you could spend my money on a yacht in Italy. You didn't just want to divorce me, you wanted to erase me from existence. Agent Miller stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Julian Vance, Victoria Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and interstate transportation of stolen property. You have the right to remain silent. An agent stepped behind Julian, pulling his arms behind his back. The metal handcuffs clicked shut with a cold, final sound. Julian did not fight. He stood up slowly, staring at the floor, his face blank. Another agent cuffed Victoria. She wept loudly, struggling slightly, as she tried to hold on to the edge of the conference table. Her designer jewelry rattled as her wrists were bound in steel. Arthur, please! Call your lawyer! Stop this! We can talk about this. My lawyer is already drafting the divorce papers, Victoria, I said. And Peterson has already submitted the 1987 letters to the prosecutor. Under Illinois law, because the marriage was entered into under fraudulent representation. From day one, we are filing for an annulment and a complete forfeiture of marital assets. You won't receive a single cent of maintenance. The court will ensure you leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it. Nothing. Jason, the acting finance director, tried to slip out the side door of the boardroom, but an FBI agent blocked his path, pushing him back. Jason was cuffed quickly, his face pale and sweating. I was just doing what they told me, he yelled, his voice high and panicky. I didn't know it was illegal. I have a family. Save it for the federal prosecutor, kid. Agent Miller said, pushing him toward the exit. Miller turned to the two representatives from Midwest Freight, who were still standing with their hands raised. You two are free to go for now, but your company will receive a federal subpoena. We will need all communications regarding the fleet purchase and the Panama consulting fee. If you cooperate, the prosecutor might show leniency. We will cooperate 100%, the lead representative said, grabbing his briefcase and rushing out the door as if the room were on fire. As the agents led Victoria, Julian, and Jason out of the boardroom, Victoria turned back to me one last time, screaming, Arthur, what about my mother? You can't leave Beatrice alone in that house. Another FBI team is at the Lake Forest house right now, Victoria, Agent Miller said, guiding her through the door. Beatrice Vance is being arrested as a co-conspirator. Her condo in Florida and her bank accounts are also being seized under the federal forfeiture order. The boardroom went quiet. The heavy oak doors swung shut, leaving Frank and me alone in the large room. The conference table was littered with unsigned contracts, folders, and the discarded DNA report. I walked to the head of the table. I pulled out the high-backed leather chair, the chair Julian had sat in so comfortably, and sat down. The leather felt cool and solid beneath me. Frank sat down in the CFO's chair. He looked at me, a long sigh escaping his lips. It's over, Arthur. The company is ours again. Yes, Frank, I said, looking out the window at the Chicago skyline. The company is ours. Let's call the dispatchers in Gary. Tell them to bring the trucks back home. Tell our drivers their jobs are safe. We have a lot of work to do, and I want to hear the engines rumble again. Our business is not going anywhere, and neither am I. The wheels of justice ground fast in the federal court system of Northern Illinois. The evidence compiled by Peterson and Special Agent Miller was too complete, too structured, and too ironclad for any defense attorney to dismantle. Julian's lawyers tried to argue that since I had raised him, he should still be considered my legal son under the family trust. But the federal judge dismissed the argument immediately. The Vance family trust explicitly used the phrase biological descendants, which had a strict genetic definition under state law. The certified DNA report proving 0.0% paternity was legally undeniable. Julian lost any claim to the trust, the estate, and the company's shares. Victoria's attorneys tried to challenge the authenticity of the 1987 letters I had found in the basement, claiming they were fabricated. But Peterson had already retained a document expert who performed ink and paper analysis, proving the paper and the handwriting belonged to Beatrice from that exact year. The Illinois judge used the term unconscionable fraud in his final ruling, applying the legal doctrine of unjust enrichment to bar Victoria from claiming a single cent of marital equity. 3 months after the arrests in the boardroom, the sentencing hearings took place. Julian Vance was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud, bank fraud, and the interstate transportation of stolen goods. He was sent to a medium-security federal facility in Wisconsin. His slick-back hair and expensive Italian suits were replaced by the orange uniform of a federal inmate. Instead of sailing a 12,000 luxury yacht, he spent his days working in the prison laundry room, earning 12 cents an hour. Victoria Vance was sentenced to 5 years for conspiracies and elder financial exploitation. The court annulled our marriage on the grounds of fraud from its inception. Dating back to 1987, the judge ruled that Victoria had entered the marriage under false pretenses, utilizing premeditated deceit to secure my assets. All her joint operational accounts were seized to pay full restitution to my personal retirement fund, which she had tried to drain. The court stripped her of all marital property. She was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a criminal record. Beatrice Vance, at 80 years old, avoided active prison time due to her age and failing health. The judge sentenced her to 3 years of home confinement under electronic monitoring, but the court did not spare her financially. Her luxury condo in Florida, which had been purchased with money from Vance Logistics accounts, was seized and sold at auction. Her bank accounts were liquidated to pay court costs. She was moved into a small, state-subsidized senior apartment, living on nothing but her basic Social Security check. The woman who had scoffed at my working-class hands was now living on the very public charity she had looked down upon. Dr. Lyle's fall was complete. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for conspiracy, mail fraud, and receiving bribes. The Illinois Medical Board permanently revoked his medical license, and he was barred from ever practicing medicine in the United States again. Chloe Vance, Julian's wife, who had been quietly preparing her bags for the move to Tuscany, was left ruined. She filed for divorce from Julian within weeks of his arrest, trying to save her own assets. But the federal investigators traced the money she had received from the joint accounts. She was forced to surrender her expensive jewelry and her luxury SUV to pay the restitution order. She ended up filing for personal bankruptcy, moving back to her parents' house. While the court cases proceeded, Frank and I set to work rebuilding Vance Logistics. Frank officially returned as the chief executive officer, and I took my place as chairman of the board. On Monday morning, we held an all-hands employee meeting on the warehouse floor. All 200 drivers and dispatchers gathered, the air smelling of diesel and grease. When I walked onto the floor, the drivers let out a loud cheer, clapping and whistling. My oldest driver, Roy, who had been with me since 1989, stood up and shouted, "Arthur, we would have driven these trucks into Lake Michigan before we let that boy sell them to Midwest." The room erupted in laughter and applause. I shook their hands, looked them in the eye, and promised them that Vance Logistics would remain a family business. The 50 flatbeds and cranes that had been hidden in Indiana were driven back to our Chicago yard. I stood in the yard watching the trucks roll through the gates in a long, roaring convoy. The sound of the diesel engines was like a symphony, a declaration that Vance Logistics was alive and well. I did not keep the sprawling Lake Forest estate. It was too large, too quiet, and filled with the ghosts of a 42-year lie. I sold the property for $4,200,000, paid off the remaining mortgage, and donated a portion of the proceeds to a local veterans charity. On the day of the closing, I left the keys on the cold marble kitchen counter, walked out the front door, and did not look back. I moved into a comfortable modern apartment in downtown Chicago overlooking the lake. It was smaller, yes, but it was mine. It was a space filled with peace, free from the whispers of vultures and the clinking of glasses celebrating my destruction. I had furnished it simply with a few leather chairs, my books, and the tools I used to restore my vintage car. I sat on my balcony on a crisp autumn evening, looking out at the lights of the city. I was 74 years old, single, and my family was in prison. By society's standards, my personal life was a disaster. But as I took a sip of my coffee, I felt a deep, profound sense of gratitude. I had my dignity, I had my company, and most importantly, I had the truth. I was Arthur Vance, and I was still standing. 3 months have passed since the day the federal agents walked Victoria and Julian out of the Vance Logistics building in handcuffs. 3 months since the silence of my empty Lake Forest estate deafened me, only to be replaced by the quiet, orderly peace of my new home. I sat in my new executive office at the Vance Logistics headquarters, the one that sits high above the Chicago River. The view was spectacular today. The autumn leaves in the park below were turning a brilliant gold and rust red, a quiet reminder that change, even when it involves things falling apart, can be beautiful. The door opened, and Frank Miller walked in. He did not knock timidly like the terrified employees Julian had hired. He walked in with the easy confidence of a man who knows he belongs. Frank looked 10 years younger, the dark circles under his eyes replaced by the spark of a man doing the work he loves. "Arthur," Frank said, placing a folder on my desk, "you are going to like this. We just secured the logistics contract for the new county hospital network, and the bank has fully restored our prime credit rating. The financial bleeding has completely stopped. We are in the black." A genuine smile, one that reached my eyes, spread across my face. "Thank you, Frank. I knew you could do it. I never should have let them force you out." "I did not go far, Arthur," Frank chuckled, sitting in the leather chair opposite me. "Just far enough to appreciate coming back." He pointed to the white ceramic mug in my hand. "Is that from the new machine in the lounge?" "No," I said, lifting the mug. "I walked down to the street corner cart. Bought it from the vendor who has been there for 20 years. $2. Cash." Frank nodded, understanding the symbolism. "It is the best cup of coffee in the world, isn't it?" "It tastes like freedom, Frank," I said, taking a slow sip. "It tastes like absolute control." Frank left to return to the operational floor, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I swiveled my chair to look out at the gray, rolling waters of Lake Michigan. I thought about where Victoria and Julian were at this very moment. Julian was in a federal prison, adjusting to its hard realities. His lawyers were trying to appeal, but Peterson's evidence was ironclad. And then there was Victoria, my ex-wife. The divorce papers had been finalized last week, the judge granting a complete annulment of the marriage based on the documented fraud dating back to 1987. She had been stripped of all claim to the Vance estate, the company, and the retirement assets. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. It was a report from the private investigator I had kept on retainer. I wanted to make sure she was not planning any legal appeals, and I wanted to know where she had ended up. I opened the folder and looked at the photo attached to the top sheet. The photo showed a woman in a faded blue uniform and white apron wiping down a table at a cheap highway diner. Her gray hair was in a messy bun, and her once manicured nails were short and unpolished. Victoria was working as a waitress, living in a tiny studio above a garage in Cicero. She took the bus to work at 5 a.m., serving coffee and eggs to truck drivers she had looked down upon for 42 years. I stared at the photo. I felt a strange emotion, but it was not pity. Pity implies that the person is a victim of unfortunate circumstances. Victoria was a victim of her own greed. She had everything, a husband who loved her, a beautiful home, unlimited wealth and security, and she threw it all away because she wanted to make me beg. She had stood in my office and told me that I would have to beg her for coffee money. She had told me that without money, a man is nothing. I reached for my personal checkbook, the one linked to the private account that only I could access. I pulled out my fountain pen, the same pen Julian had used to sign the forged contracts. I uncapped it and smoothed out the check. I wrote Victoria's name on the payee line. In the box for the amount, I wrote the number carefully, $500. I wrote it out in words on the line below, $500. It was the exact amount she had put on that cheap green dot debit card. the exact amount she had tossed on my desk, claiming it was enough for an old man to survive on for a week. I tore the check from the book with a clean, crisp rip. I pulled out a sheet of my personal stationery and wrote a short note. I did not ask how she was, and I did not express any anger. I simply wrote, "Here is your allowance. Breakfast is on me. Do not spend it all on wine." I folded the check inside the note, placed it in an envelope, and sealed it. I pressed my thumb against the paper, feeling the finality of the act. It was petty, yes, but it was also a necessary closing period at the end of a long, painful chapter. It was my way of telling her that the power dynamic had permanently shifted. I was no longer the beggar, I was the benefactor, and she was finally learning the value of a dollar earned through labor. I called my new assistant into the office. "Susan, please have this mailed, certified mail. I want to make sure she receives it personally." "Right away, Mr. Vance," she said, taking the envelope and walking out. I sat back in my leather chair, taking another sip of my coffee. It was cold now, but it did not matter. I felt warm inside. I looked around my office. It was quiet. For a long time I was afraid of the silence. I thought silence meant loneliness. I thought that a house filled with people, even a house filled with vipers, was better than an empty one. I was wrong. Silence is not empty. It is full of peace. From my story, we learn a harsh but necessary truth about the nature of relationships and resources. Blood may connect us biologically, but it does not guarantee loyalty, respect, or love. True family is defined by how they treat you when you are vulnerable, not by how much they can extract from you. When you are strong, we must never hand over the keys to our life, our dignity, or our hard-earned success to anyone, even our children, without verifying their character first. Generosity without boundaries is not love. It is just fuel for entitlement. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is cut the cord and let people face the consequences of their own actions.